Yes, and we do ask everyone who's in the panel or in our audience to just mute your mic if you're not speaking, just to remove any errant noise. And that's just for quality of the recording. And with that, we'll get started. We are beginning with Dr. Tim Cooper, who's joining us from the University of Nottingham, Trent. He works with the School of Architecture and Design Build, and his research focuses in sustainable design and sustainable consumption. He is head of the Sustainable Consumption and Clothing Sustainability Research Groups, as well as a member of the product design team. And he focuses on leading his university's Sustainable Futures Strategic Research theme, and has many focuses in sustainability. And with that, I will share his slides. Nope, not a window. If I can figure this out. All right, we're going the entire screen. There we go. Can everyone see it?
It's come and gone. Here we go.
All right, I think if I hit edit, I can present. It's been a while since I've used PowerPoint. I have to remember where that button is.
It's in the bottom right, America. Bottom right next to the Zoom bar. Left, go left to the left of the Zoom bar. That, to the right, one to the right, and that's it. Oh,
Oh gosh.
one to the right. Where? One more to the right. There you go.
Ah, there we are. All right, whenever you're ready, Dr. Cooper.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the invitation to present this and share some time discussing these important issues with you. So I've got a presentation going to last about 10-15 minutes, just overviewing the kind of research that I'm doing and have been doing in recent years in the UK. First slide, please. So as we know, one of the key problems underlying the unsustainable nature of our economies, our societies, is overconsumption. It's well recognized now that this is causing many problems, threatening raw material security, causing excessive pollution, waste, and of course, above all, contributing to climate change. We have a rising population, and that's just going to accelerate the problems. But a lot of my work is looking at how this relates to materials and how materials are used. And one of the underlying assumptions based on data is that we cannot carry on consuming the amount of materials that we are at the moment. As you see from the final bullet point there, the amount of materials extracted from the earth has doubled in the past 30 years and is projected to increase by around about 50% more by 2030. Next slide, please. One of the models that's being used increasingly in Europe is the idea of a circular economy. And some of you may be familiar with this idea, but in brief, the assumption of the circular economy is that we can no longer presume we have unlimited resources and an unlimited sink in which to dump our waste at the end of our lifetimes. We need to move towards circularity, and that means that we have to reuse materials and products that have been used in the past, but also, and critically for the work that I'm doing, we have to slow down the cycles, not just close the loops. So in other words, we don't just have to reuse materials that have been used, but also we actually have to change the speed at which those materials are used. And the reason for that is this: that whenever you use materials, whether or not it's virgin materials or recycled materials, environmental impacts happen. Because the recycling process, while people see it as environmentally friendly, still has negative environmental impacts. It has an impact on energy, transportation, reprocessing and manufacturing of goods. And also, it's not a perfect system. So you it is very rare you get 100% pure recycling, because materials degrade in second and third and fourth use. So the idea of a circular economy is firstly that we need to recycle more, but much more than that, we need to slow down the throughput of materials in the economy. Next slide, please. The problem that we have is that in our modern industrialized societies, mass production offers speed and volume, but in the process of creating those products, prices come down, but there's no full recognition of the value within the product. So, for example, when you sell a car, it loses a substantial proportion of its value as soon as it leaves the garage, and it's estimated that within the first 3 years, it's lost half its value. Moreover, not only do products depreciate in value quickly, when you look at the actual component materials and parts, they are worth very little. So you'll see in the image to the left there, the value of products once recycled is diminished very substantially from cost of the original product. You can to a degree, though, retain value through reuse both of products and of parts. And the circular economy debate is often around the idea that we need to find ways of retaining the value that's embodied before they're ultimately recycled. Next slide, please. So we've had this emerging debate. I don't know how this has affected you in the United States, but in in Europe, there's increasingly in the news the need that we need to move towards a circular economy. But within that debate, we need to address issues such as planned obsolescence and product lifetime. So the European Union has a circular economy action plan, which was updated earlier this year. We're looking at opportunities to, first of all, ban the practice of planned obsolescence, have minimum standards for product lifetimes, and to complement that, we're looking at ways to inform the consumer better, so the consumers who don't like the society and recognise the need to move beyond it are better informed about how long products have been designed to last for, and that can become more factor in their product choices. This is seen also in academia, where we now have a conference. I set it up in 2015, held every 2 years, and around 200 academics meet together to discuss the knowledge that we currently have on this important relationship between product longevity and the environment. Next slide, please. So in the remaining few minutes, I want to just address 3 areas of work in which we work first. I work in a design department, although in fact my background is I'm a social scientist. I had a first degree in economics. But my work crosses different disciplines, different product sectors. Much of my work, because it is concerned with lifetimes, relates to things, to types of products that are either subject to fashion or technology, because both accelerate change in society. So I do work on clothing, looking at some of the tension in the fashion sector and an industry that has any environmental impacts. I do work on electrical appliances, looking at how to people can needs that they have for moving forward with the times and capturing the benefits that we have of new technology, but also recognizing that the electrical goods sector is another one that has major environmental impacts. And at this time, I'll just say a little bit about upcycling as well. Next slide. So just fashion, the fashion sector is one of the most environmentally damaging, and it's one which is causing more and more problems. Production is rising, it's doubled in the past 15 years. It accounts for 10% of carbon emissions globally. It uses vast amounts of pesticides and water. Much clothing is made from polyester, which of course is oil-based and very rarely recycled. And we have the growing problem of the damage done by clothing in use through laundering, for example, and through wear of plastic microfibers, which are entering the environment. Next slide, please. The issues of trying to address the throwaway culture, short-lived products, are exposed in a product such as clothing, and in particular, there are a range of different variables to explore, both physical problems with products and how we use products. So we've done work at Nottingham Trent both about how we can design and make products that will last longer. That's only half of the problem, because we know that a multitude of garments are discarded that still have functionality. So we also have to look at what's called design for durability or emotional durability, and also some of the other problems with something like clothing, such as the fact that our bodies change over time. And all too often we have to throw things away because we become thinner or fatter, most often as we get older, the latter. Next slide, please. So to help wrestle with these issues, one of the things we've done at Nottingham Trent is produce a toolkit. We've worked a lot with some of the leading retailers in the UK and developed a toolkit through a grant funded, produced by prepared, offered to us by our government, called the Clothing Durability Dozen, where we look at different ways in which companies can explore opportunities to make money, remain profit while selling fewer garments. And that's a real issue that's faced by any company. If we want to move towards sustainability, if we want to reduce the size, the amount of throughput of garments in society, how can we do it whilst companies still make a profit? Next slide, please. So we have 12 different approaches, and I can very happily go through these, but I want to keep my presentation brief. So I want to move next onto the next slide, where we look at another important area, electrical goods. And electrical appliances are ubiquitous in society. More and more products that we buy have electronic components in them, and yet these are very problematic. Next slide, please. We've done work in particular in a recent study on vacuum cleaners. Why did we choose vacuum cleaners? Because among electrical goods, it's the second largest source of embodied carbon emissions. In other words, there's a fast throughput, they don't last very long, and they're mostly made from plastic, which is a fossil fuel. We're also suspicious of the longevity of vacuum cleaners. As of many products, we suspect their lifetimes are going down, and that accompanying that, people's expectations of lifetimes are going down as well. And this leads to, through some research we've done to complement this study, that we need to address expectations. Next slide, please. We did a survey of around 2,000 consumers and asked people, were they satisfied with how long products lasted? And we chose 18 different types of consumer durable. And my research assistant, when he produced the data, came to my office with shock. He said, well, people are happy after all. We don't have to worry about it. I said, of course we have to worry about it. They may be happy, but that's because they're not aware of the severity of the problems, and many of them are not aware of how long products could last if they were designed and manufactured appropriately. There are lots of reasons why we've had this decline in expectations. It might be just that we can't do anything about it. It might be that we don't remember the past. It might be that the manufacturers convince us that the new is always preferable. But we need to address these expectations. Even though people might seem satisfied, if there was, for example, any change in the law to make products last longer, we need to have consumers on board. So somehow we need to find ways of shaping attitudes and behaviour there. Next slide, please. Consumers also may be to fault in how long things last. So one of the aims of our study on vacuum cleaners was to see how consumers bought, used, and then discarded vacuum cleaners. And we found some signs that one of the problems is that designers may be designing products to last, but they're not well maintained by consumers. So, for example, barely a half of consumers said that they regularly ensured that the brush head was free of hair or dirt. Many of them didn't think that vacuums ever needed any kind of servicing. Some didn't even know that they include a filter that might need changing. Next slide, please. So what we did was to do what's called co-creation. We worked with consumers, with our design students, to explore opportunities to design vacuum cleaners that were made to last and that people would want to keep for longer. We asked, what are the things about vacuum cleaners that you find most frustrating? What are the things about vacuum cleaners that you find most enjoyable? Next slide. And our design students, on the basis of those co-creation workshops, came up with different types of vacuum cleaner, each of them modeling aspects that were raised by consumers. One was the possibility of having some kind of sign that the vacuum cleaner needed servicing. So at the top, we had a color-coded handle that would turn red when you needed to change the filter or check the brush head, because the vacuum cleaner wasn't being as efficient as it was designed to be. We also looked at emotions. So we looked at the so-called yuck factor. How can you address the fact that people don't like handling dirt? And this design included something called design parceling, where the design will be taken away in a biodegradable plastic container to go straight in the bin. We looked at convenience. So we looked at how easy vacuum cleaners are to repair. If a part failed, would they just be thrown? Would the vacuum cleaner be thrown away, or could it be made much easier for the consumer to replace that part themselves? And we looked at our senses, our relationship with our vacuum cleaners. Do we throw them away, for example, because they're made of to look fashionable? And are they designed in a way that prevents scratches? Obviously, vacuum cleaners being things that often knock against walls and surfaces. And through that, we came up with some solutions. Next slide, please. Finally, the third example is upcycling. One of the problems we have is this fast throughput of materials in society. Sometimes you can reuse products, and we've seen a growth in reuse through a whole range of different ways. The growth of eBay, the growth of other reuse markets on Facebook and the like, the increase of repair through repair cafes. But one of the problems is that ultimately we have products that people just don't want. So can we find ways of using the material that's in those products rather than just recycling it, which is labor intensive and energy intensive, which is energy intensive? Can we upcycle those materials or components and use those in new ways? Next slide, please. Upcycling adds value to an item in a way that recycling tends to minimize. Next slide, please. So here we see examples of wooden pallets being turned into a compost heap, fabrics from curtains being made into a glamorous dress, leather from haulier, from lorry haulier covering turned into a bag. And on the next slide, we see other examples. We see a piano turned into a bookcase, a flute turned into a light bulb to be put on, bread bins turned into cabinet corners, and bicycles turned into bar stools. All very innovative, creative ways of using materials without having to recycle them. It also overcomes the problem that sometimes materials aren't recyclable in any case because they're composites. Next slide, please. But we need to find ways of turning upcycling, which is often a hobby, into a mainstream industry. And there's a growing amount of work being done to identify how small niches of good practice can be turned into large-scale industry. Next slide. So to conclude, this is a summary of some challenges in my research area. So I hope to present today areas where we can see opportunities and needs for moving away from our throwaway culture to one where products are designed to last. And that's going to involve all stakeholders, government, industry, and consumers. For industry, there are going to be certain strategic options they have to make. In a world of fast fashion, for example, do we move away from short-lived garments, or do we just make them 100% recyclable? Industry needs to find ways of moving beyond current norms and current expectations to reverse the trend towards increased consumption of garments year by year. In the case of consumers, How can we engage consumers in this debate? We've found through our research there's a degree of complacency that consumers have become satisfied with product lifetimes, even though they've been in decline. We need to find ways of motivating change, behavioural change, and also what we call user product attachment. In other words, how can we enable consumers to want to keep things for longer? Some of the changes will be systemic. It's not just a question of changing a product to make it last longer, but also rather more complex issues. So in the case of, for example, upcycling, how can we collect discarded products in a way that retains their value as far as possible so the components can be used again for a different purpose? Maybe it involves new business models also. Moving away from markets where goods are sold to where goods are rented. It may indeed have implications for the very way in which we acquire goods. And we're seeing trends, obviously, through COVID, moving away from retail shops to other mechanisms for consumers to receive their products. And lastly, there's a need for government involvement. All this won't happen just by academic studies and a bit of goodwill. We need support from governments to enable the change. In Europe, for example, we're already seeing a move towards minimum product standards, looking at labels for products that will enable consumers to choose longer lasting products, but also banning the most short-lived products. We also, and I speak as an economist here, we need to see price mechanisms that support sustainable production and consumption. In other words, reducing the cost of labour and increasing the cost of energy and materials. So we have a switching in the economy such that it becomes better to maintain and easier to maintain things, more cost effective to maintain things, rather than buy the newest and the latest and the cheapest. Thanks for your attention. I'm looking forward to the debate and the other presentations.
Hi, Kelsey. I'll just share my screen if you want me to.
No problem. I'll hit stop presenting and then you can go ahead.
All
While
right.
you're doing that, if you don't mind, I'll give you a brief introduction while you get that all set up.
Sure, sounds good.
Can
you see that okay?
Nope, I don't see it just yet.
Okay.
Dr. Goodstein is here with us from Bard College, their Center for Environmental Policy. He's the director for that center, and as well as the MBA in Sustainability at Bard. He's worked with national educational initiatives on climate change involving many colleges, universities, high schools, and communities. And he's worked to increase awareness about environmental stability and sustainability. He's written articles for the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, as well as Ecological Economics and Environmental Management. And he's been featured in the New York Times, the Scientific American, Time Magazine, as well as Chemical and Engineering News, The Economist, and many more. All right.
Great. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay. Good. Well, thank you. I am an economist by training as well as Tim. I'm not a researcher in this space, but I run graduate programs in sustainability at Bard College, which is about 90 miles north of New York City on the Hudson River. And so I'm going to share sort of some broader thoughts about how we address overconsumption and the challenges of really meeting the needs of 8, soon to be 9, soon to be 10 billion people in a world where, we're already fighting over water and oil and topsoil and fish and forests and biodiversity, where half the people alive today are barely getting by on just a few dollars a day, and everybody's aspiring to more and a better quality of life. And that fundamentally is the sustainability challenge, right? And I know that you all want to be part of that and figure out how to lead the change. Just a little bit of background about me. The degree options that I run really kind of reflect around the ways in which you can change the future. And I think of that as kind of three avenues. Policy, that's about changing the rules, and Tim talked about some of the ways that we need to change the rules to incentivize a circular economy. So we offer MS degrees in environmental policy and climate science and policy. There's education, fundamentally changing people's minds And that's obviously also part of a solution to responsible production and consumption. And so we offer an MED in environmental education, one of only 6 programs in the world that, in the US, excuse me, that do that. Really designed to provide people the skills to build out environmental education programs. And then finally, there's changing the game, and that's business. Because no matter how many minds we change and no matter how many rules we change, at the end of the day, we've got to figure out, how to keep the lights on, get food on the table, get our health care in ways that radically reduce the environmental impacts. We're talking 80, 90% reductions in pollution levels around carbon dioxide, but also plastics, toxics in the water, impacts on environmental justice communities, biodiversity loss, but also businesses that treat workers and communities and suppliers with justice and with respect, because responsible production, you can't just be an environmentally engaged company. You've also got to be socially responsible. So I'm really going to approach this at a broad level of overview. Before I do, if you are interested in sustainability careers, something that you would like to pursue, in addition to our graduate programs, we offer weekend workshops twice a year, the CDC Fellows Program, where we really help you think through how to develop the visions kind of a new future and a new way of doing things, but also the skills for bringing that vision to a reality. Our next workshop is actually Saturday. That one's filled up. But in March, there's one. I'll put my email in the chat, and you should feel free to get in touch. So as I touched on, if we talk about responsible production and consumption, that's not just environmental, but it's also social, right? So workers, suppliers, and communities. Human rights has sort of been a longstanding interest in kind of ensuring that there's no slave labor or exploitation of workers in the supply chain, but also pay equity and more recently a very timely and necessary focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, racial justice. How do we build genuinely anti-racist organizations? On the environmental side, I like an analogy that my friend Lisa Hammond at Cliff Bar, who's their sustainability director, uses, which is really a way to kind of capture the circular vision. Businesses need to think like a tree. Trees run on solar energy. They don't run on fossil fuels. Trees are fundamentally circular, right? They live in a system in which there is no pollution. All waste from one production process, the leaves that fall off every year, the trees themselves that fall down and die, become food for another production process. And we need to move in that direction of circular systems, industrial ecology, designed by nature, biomimicry. Fundamentally, that is the way through to figure out how we're going to meet the needs of 9 or 10 billion people on this one planet. And then finally, and this has become more important part of the dialogue recently, is that trees also regenerate their environments, right? They leave the soil and the world around them richer than when they started out, and more capable of supporting other life. And by analogy, a regenerative business is going to enrich the community and make it capable of supporting other regenerative businesses. So that's kind of the conceptual vision of responsible business. How do you do it? I could point you to a thing called the B Corp world, a certification process that has a really nice checklist that can help businesses move along a journey towards achieving social and environmental responsibility. Mostly smaller companies that are doing this, but Danone Yogurt North America, which you guys have probably bought products from, is now the biggest publicly traded company that's gone through this kind of certification process. So there's a whole movement around responsible business, and there's lots of energy there. It's really what our MBA does, right? The MBA program that we run is called, it's an MBA in sustainability. It's really one of a handful of business programs around the world that fully integrates a focus on mission-driven business and sustainability into a core MBA. If we step back from thinking about the idea of responsible business and put it in context of of the world in which we live, there's a very famous relationship called the IPAT equation. It says that if we want to think about environmental impact or social impact of business, you can divide it into three factors. Number one is the number of people, and I talked about that already, rising. But the other two are consumption and production. So affluence is the A in IPAT, and technology is the production side. So simply put, here's a application of this. If there's 8 billion people on the planet, and we're thinking about the impact of beef production, and here I'm talking about feedlot beef, not grass-fed beef. Turns out there's about 8.7 kilograms of beef are consumed per person per year. I think that's per year. So that's the affluence. That's just the amount of beef that on average everybody's consuming. And then it turns out that from every kilogram of beef that's consumed, about 22 kilograms of carbon dioxide is going to be released into the atmosphere to heat up the planet. That's a global warming pollutant. So if we take 8 billion people, multiply that times 8.7 kilograms of beef per person per year, multiply that times 22 kilograms CO2 per kilogram of beef, population times affluence or consumption times technology on the production side, then you get about 1.5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide per year emitted into the atmosphere, causing the planet to heat up from the consumption of beef. Now, this is useful because you can think about how do we solve the global warming problem, right? Well, one way would be to reduce beef consumption, and that's actually a very important thing we all can do. Switch over to chicken or tofu. Chicken, it has like, I think 1/10 of the footprint of beef on a per pound basis. Beef is particularly bad, or switch to grass-fed beef. So there's ways that we can reduce the amount of beef we're consuming, but there's also a way we could kind of clean up the beef. People have talked about feeding cattle kelp to reduce their burping, which is the methane emissions, which is a significant component of the pollution that beef causes. So you can approach any kind of problem from an affluence perspective, a consumption, overconsumption perspective, or a technology side. Just to give you an example of scale, on the affluence side, if you look at the US, we consume about 14,000 gallons per person of oil every year. Every one of us Americans consumes about 14,000 gallons of oil through air travel, car travel, heating our homes, charging our devices, running our electric devices. Germans, on the other hand, consume about half of that, about 8,000 gallons of oil equivalent in all of their energy that they use. And so you can see you can make a big difference on the affluent side. You can use a lot less energy, but it's not typically going to come through people turning off their lights. It's not so much an individual choice. It really is about a whole system. And we could talk about why do Germans use a lot less electricity, a lot less gas, a lot less oil. On the technology side, for example, we could move towards solar electric cars versus gasoline cars, and we could essentially eliminate the use of oil in cars. We could do that in 10 years. So I guess the point I want to leave you here is that while we think about overconsumption as an individual choice, it's really more often something that's baked into the system. And we have to think about how we're going to change the system in order to really dramatically reduce consumption. It's not really about people choosing to go off the grid or choosing to use less of this or that, although it can be in sometimes. Whereas technology can often give you a bigger leverage if you have access to those opportunities. I'm going to just end quickly on this picture. This is showing air passenger miles in the US rising from at a peak back in, say, 2002 to about 70,000 miles, in a given time period. This is probably per month, up to over 100,000. It's probably million. It's just way more than that. This is 100 million, excuse me. So rising from 70 million to 100 million. And then you can see what happened to air travel with COVID, right? It almost went to zero. It's starting to peak back up. And I put this up here because air travel is probably the worst thing that anybody can do in a short period of time to cause climate change. Essentially, it's one-on-one with car travel. So, if you think about it, the average car travels about 12,000 miles a year. One trip from New York to Seattle and back, that's essentially 6,000 miles of car travel, 6,000 miles of air travel, roughly equivalent. So if you take one cross-country trip, round trip, you've essentially, increased your impact of oil use, fuel use by 50%. So if we wanted to attack climate change, this is definitely a place where individual choice can matter, right? If you choose to fly less, you're going to have a substantially reduced impact on the planet. And we may be learning some lessons through COVID and also the growth of technology alternatives, such as video dialogues, that could get us there. And if you are going to fly, and I have family in Korea, my daughters live in Texas and Colorado, New Mexico, and Oregon, so I'm not going to give up flying. I'm going to keep flying. What could I do about that? Well, I want to leave you with one story. You may have heard that Etsy, the online retailer, about a year ago decided to go 100% carbon neutral with their shipping. And they did that by buying quality offsets, right? So for every mile that they're shipping a package, they calculate the carbon emissions, and then they'll invest in new wind projects or they'll invest in tree farms or afforestation projects. And this is the kind of impact that we really need you all to make in your lives in the coming years, because we know where this idea emerged and how it came to fruition. It came from this woman, Chelsea Mosen. She was, for her capstone project in our MBA, she interned at Etsy and actually developed this vision. They liked her, they hired her on, she joined the energy team. 4 years later, she was the chief sustainability officer, and she was able to implement this. So this is really what we're looking to you for, about either if you want to work in changing the rules, policy, if you want to work on changing minds, education, changing the game, that's business. But ultimately, it's about leading the change, and we need you to do that. So thanks, and I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goodstein, and I believe we're moving on to Dr. Gould. If you have slides, or if you just want to take a moment to prepare yourself mentally, I'll go ahead and give you a brief introduction, and then you can go ahead and begin. So Dr. Gould, as I said at the beginning to some of us before we started the recording, is from University of Vermont, which is right next door to Champlain College, although that might as well be a million miles away now that everyone is scattered to the winds. She works with collaborative interdisciplinary research to investigate relationships between ecosystems and our well-being, as well as environmental values, learning, and human behavior. And she works with environmental learning and diversity as well as equity. And she has two main research areas, the cultural ecosystem services and environmental education. And using those lenses, she wants to see how nature improves well-being in non-material ways, such as not destroying all of our rainforests, and using environmental education to teach people the importance of that relationship. Now, without further ado, you can go ahead and begin.
Great. Can I just check? Can you see my first slide?
Yep.
Is that working? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really interesting to be on a panel with such a diverse group of co-presenters, and I really appreciate what you're doing at Champlain College to focus on the SDGs. So thank you for inviting me. And there's lots of overlap. I'm really excited, as Dr. Cooper said, to have the conversation with everybody, because there's lots of overlap with what I plan to discuss. So as Kelsey just said, I study two main things. I would say I would expand out from cultural ecosystem services to talk about environmental values. So the first area I study is environmental values, and the second is environmental education. So I am in the School of Natural Resources at UVM and the environmental program, and don't have a discipline. All of my training has been interdisciplinary. So that may come through as I go along. So what I wanted to do today was just talk about three main things in the next 10 minutes. The prevalence of waste in so this, the first bullet is a past project that I've done. So some research I did a couple of years ago, and which has to do with responsible production consumption. And then the second bullet point is just to talk about some theory, not stuff I've developed, but just some general ways of thinking about environmental behavior. It's a really good follow-on to what Dr. Goodstein was just talking about, and Dr. Cooper as well, both. So both of them totally related. And then I wanted to close with a couple big picture thoughts from a workshop I just attended. So talking about this project that I did a few years ago. So this is a past project on pro-environmental behavior, and it was comprised, this portion was 14 community listening sessions in the San Francisco Bay Area. So these were essentially focus groups, but very open-ended focus groups where we were asking people to talk about environmental learning and environmental behavior. So the relationship between where they learn, how they learn, from whom they learn, and their behavior. And so the little portion I'm going to talk about right now is that there was a really striking result related to behavior. And so the connection here is related to this, that as Dr. Goodstein and Dr. Cooper have discussed, there is a big element of what people are doing here and how they're deciding and how they're acting related to the environment. So I'm going to focus on that. And so we prompted in this research people to talk about 3 types of environmental behavior. So we specifically asked people to talk about transportation, how they make those decisions, how they learn about transportation, food-related behavior, and outdoor activities. So we asked about those 3. The striking thing that happened was that I'm going to show you what people talked about. So the number of times people mentioned different activities. And so here you can see on the y-axis, we have the number of times people talked about these various activities. And then on the x-axis, the different types of behavior. The yellow ones are the ones that we prompted for, and the blue ones are the ones that we didn't prompt for. So the striking thing here is that waste is very prevalent. It was basically statistically the same. People talked about it equally as much as they talked about transportation, which we asked them questions about. And they talked about it way more than food and outdoor activities. And in the context of analyzing qualitative data and then accompanying quantitative data through a parallel project, what became evident is that there's this sort of tendency to talk about waste because it is easy. And this relates to, I think, something that Dr. Cooper said, that recycling is an excuse to produce more. So this is very related to this, that people would say, oh, well, I recycle. That's the first thing people said that they did that was an environmental action, and really focused on that as sort of a get out of jail card, a get out free card, which is, I think, really related to it. Dr. Cooper was saying is that recycling is this sort of excuse that allows you to consume more. So another way of looking at this is if we drill down into that second blue bar, we drill down into the waste bar, what were they saying? What were people saying about waste? And so these are the kinds of waste, the nature of the comments within things that we coded as waste. And again, here, I sort of divided these into things that are actually about waste. So that metaphor of the tree, so thinking about waste as something that's leaving the system versus thinking about reduce, reuse, that whole like getting to the first parts of the reduce, reuse, recycle, and really trying to reduce what we're producing and have a more, what I would call, responsible consumption rather than just recycling something in an inefficient way, as Dr. Cooper was talking about. So again, vast majority of what people were talking about was trash and recycling and composting. And so the way this is connected is this, I think, as I've said, that this is easier. It's easier to say, well, I'm just recycling. It's a very easy change to make. It doesn't require a lot of lifestyle change. You don't have to learn very much to do it. And so there's this tendency to think about, I'm checking the boxes if I'm doing some pretty easy things. And this is among a population that largely is known to be sort of environmentally conscious, right, in the San Francisco Bay Area, but not super impressive degree of depth of the way that people were talking about issues of what it means to be environmental. So that's sort of one snippet, a piece of work that I've done. And then for the next section, I just want to talk about some theory that really puts in to context the examples that we've just heard about. So one thing is this discussion of, are we talking about behavior or practices? Depending on what discipline you're in, you use different words to refer to those things. And it's related to the point about, is behavior individual or is it really influenced by collective sociological processes? So the question here related to this panel is, why do we consume as we do? What's influencing why we have the consumption behaviors that we have? And so again, I'm just going to summarize in a couple slides some literature that I find helpful from the gigantic amount of literature on environmental behavior and environmental practices. So from the 1970s is when, the 70s is when we started to think about the environment, started to be a construct that existed. and in Western culture anyway. And this is the first model that we had of environmental behavior, was that you learn something and that changes your attitude and then you change your behavior. And this is the way people thought things worked. However, basically all research since then has shown that this is not accurate. It's much too simplistic, and that this is not the way the world is. So this model is called a deficit model, this idea that the only deficit, people just don't know. And once people know, they'll change their behavior. Once we tell people what they need to do, oh, they'll change their behavior immediately. Also called a pipe model, sort of like this, we're just going to shoot some information down a pipe and out the other end we'll get behavior. So too simplistic, basically. So this was in the 70s, and then about 20 years ago almost, and which is still kind of accurate. This is the way we think about it now. A little bit more complicated. So this is the way, sort of this idea that there's so many other factors going on. And I think going off of what Dr. Goodstein said, the boxes on the left talk about internal factors versus external factors. And what's interesting in this field is that in the psychology field in particular, which has done a lot of studying of behavior with that term, the internal factors get most attention. So this question of, are you deciding to fly less? And how much do you know? And how are you making these decisions personally? So that gets a lot of attention in a certain realm of this work. And so you can see all these things. So emotions are part of this, attitudes are part of this, knowledge is part of this. And then there's a separate sort of piece of work that are connected. This work is connected in various ways. The external factors, and in the psychology world, these get a little bit less attention. But things like infrastructure, so exactly what we've discussed. So infrastructure, political factors, socio and cultural factors. And so basically, that's one way of thinking about. There's this complex array of influences, and so I would say from my values work, yes, values do impact behavior, certainly. There are people, and we've heard examples. However, there's also a gigantic amount of constraint that comes from the context that really determines a lot of the sort of operating space and what is possible. So to go into a little bit more in those external factors, I want to talk about these ideas of comfort, cleanliness, and convenience. Elizabeth Shove, who has really just done some really interesting work about norms, so social norms, what we see as appropriate, what we see as typical and desirable in terms of society. So to talk about this really, really briefly, her work is about structure. So this is what Dr. Goodstein was saying, that what matters is the structure of the society and what it leads people into to do. And she talks about, for instance, technology and its engulfing qualities. So the fact that most people aren't questioning the technology that's given to them. And so what she talks a lot about in terms of comfort, when she talks about comfort, is air conditioning. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And then she talks about cultural repertoires. So again, what's assumed, what's appropriate in our cultures, and bathing is her example there. How often do we bathe, and how important is it that we're using lots of products in the bathing world? And then another construct that she has that I think is helpful is that she says to understand behavior, we need to think about two kinds of influences. Vertical integration, which is top-down influences. So this is coming from policy and the sort of power structures of society that are impacting what we do. And also horizontal integration, which he calls lateral influences. So this is where social norms would come into play. This idea of what people around us are doing becomes really important. So just this might be helpful in thinking about how do we get to responsible consumption, and how do we think about it's not just knowledge that matters. This is an example, The Art of Bathing. This is from Lush, just an example of really intense consumption related to bathing. So for example, there's this whole world around bathing that has a lot of materials associated with it. She talks about air conditioning and the role that this organization, ASHRAE, has in setting our standard that 70 degrees Fahrenheit is the temperature it should be inside. And so that this has huge impacts on climate change and how much energy is used, that everyone expects it to be 70 degrees all the time. An interesting example of a society making a structural change to change the norms around temperature inside is Japan. So if you haven't heard about this, they, a few years ago, rolled out this Cool Biz, Warm Biz program that was designed to say, in the summer, we're not going to use as much air conditioning. You just have to do things that keep you cool. Conversely, in the winter, we're not going to heat like crazy. You need to do things that are going to keep you warm. And so these are the examples. So on the left, in summer, you need to eat ice cream and fruits and wear tank tops and not a lot of clothing, bring a fan. Conversely, in the winter, eat warm foods, blankets, jackets. So here's a great example of the way you should dress in different seasons. So they said this is the way. So the appropriate business attire isn't going to be a big suit all the time. It's going to depend on what temperature it is outside. And that's going to influence the amount that we have to heat our buildings. Okay. And I'll just close up with a few big picture thoughts from this workshop that I was just at this week, which was the National Academy of Sciences had a really interesting workshop on sustainability science that is going to be available if you're interested in it. It was probably about 12 hours total over 3 days. Fascinating summaries by some really amazing researchers working on sustainability science, and I was an observer. And one of the things that is relevant to responsible consumption, I think, is that they discussed how globalization is a pervasive condition of our lives, and that has benefits and drawbacks. It's not neither good nor bad, it just is, and we have to accept it. And I think as we think about consumption, we have to think about that it's really, really difficult because of this to make decisions as an individual, to even know what the impacts of your choices are. This relates to fashion that Dr. Cooper was talking about. Like, wow, there's a lot you have to do as an individual to figure out if your clothes are sustainable or not. And so just thinking about this, it makes responsible consumption and production very complicated. And so this idea of needing systemic change is really important. And I guess I just want to end on, there was a panel on governance. These are the folks involved. And the fellow top middle is Chuks Okerke from Nigeria. And he ended, his final word that he wanted to say was, if we're moving towards sustainability, what we should do is follow the numbers and follow the money. And this idea of like, that's how we're going to figure out how to get to sustainability. And I think when we're thinking about responsible consumption, looking at the influence of the powers that be and trying to change that seems important. So I will end there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gould. And now I think we move on to Dr. Sroufe. If you want to set up your slides, I'll give you your brief introduction.
I'll just let you, I'll let you go ahead and forward the slides.
All right, hold on.
Go ahead and watch.
All right, hold on just a second while I get those set up for us. Here we are. Open with PowerPoint, and now I know where the button is, so that should take us a little bit less time. There we are. Can everybody see that?
Yep. Excellent.
All right. So Dr. Sroufe, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is from, now I'm not sure how to pronounce that university name. Is that Duquesne?
Duquesne.
Duquesne University. He is with us from the Sustainable Businesses Practices Program. And, oof, hang on, my thing's mad at me. There we are. He is chair of the Global Competitiveness and professor of Sustainability and Supply Chain Management there. And he's been working with business practices to promote responsible consumption from that end. And I will let you go ahead. Just let me know when you want me to move slide to slide, and I will do that.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and for everyone else there at the UN Association for setting this up. I find it either very ironic or very well placed in terms of looking at UN SDG number 12 right after Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So I think your timing is perfect. So I'm going to give you all the credit for that. Contact information is here on the slides if anybody wants to get to those, or you can follow up with me in the chat or any other time after this if anybody needs to. We can go ahead and move on into the next slide. And in doing that, what I'm involved in, what I'm interested in, why sustainability, right? So as an endowed chair within an MBA and sustainability program, we were just recently ranked the #1 program in the United States. It's a 12-month-long MBA with international study abroad embedded within that. And to build off of some information that came out of Eban's slides also, we actually do offsets for our travel now when we're doing air travel for that. We go all over the world when doing this. When talking about some of Rachel's information too, it's, we try to inform these people to begin with so that they can make informed decisions, hopefully get to better outcomes, and think about that, not just in terms of the travel, but other things. Even Eban brought up beef. Just last weekend, I had some cricket cookies with my daughters, right, to try to help engage them and also my students, because we have them in class, about different ways to do this. Because if we're going to get beef from CAFOs, it's about 2,000 gallons of water for a pound of beef versus 1 gallon, maybe for a pound of crickets. Or if you think about how many gallons does it take to create a 2-liter of Coca-Cola, about 500 gallons of water, which is pretty crazy. No one really sees beyond the point of sale, the purchase, the thing that they use or consume. So what I like to be involved in is experiential learning and trying to be a designer to design experiences that allow them to understand and better integrate sustainability. So part of that is through one of the books I have is Integrated Management. And it actually starts with understanding how to do this and actually setting up MBA teams to experience this as, if you look out the windows of our buildings in downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, choose 4 companies, and then figure out what you would do if you were taking over those companies as a portfolio manager. And if you throw this off to, I'm going to, cut off the knees of the Ivy Leagues, right? You throw them over to some of their MBAs, what they're going to do, they're going to look for lowest cost solutions, cut manpower, get, better returns on investment for some things. Abitiba might be part of it, but they're going to look at incremental and cost. Instead, I want my students to look and see the integrated systems that connect all of them and realize sustainability is already part of what they do in any function within a business. So it's part of any professional association that's already out there. There's drivers, enablers, and performance metrics already available to us. So we embed that in the start of the book and doing simulations and role play early on with that. We can define sustainability and what is and is not sustainable for any enterprise. We do that by a customized approach to doing this, 5-level framework for it that was built off of the natural step, and some work that I've been able to do with Johan Broman and Karl-Henrik Robert, who are formerly known for the natural step program in Sweden. When I was living over there and doing some work with them, and my family was with me. So that gets me into some elements of the experiential learning part of this. In the invite email to me, it also talked about how I do this in terms of, I do live consulting project work year-round with my students. So I have right now 5 teams of MBAs actually working with a Fortune 50 company in RFID tags, Avery Dennison, the city of Pittsburgh, and a circular economy project, an upstart company in venture capitalism, and actually creating biotechnology in a micro or nano level for things that are 100 times smaller than the width of a hair. And they can reproduce a 3-dimensional structure almost exactly the same each time. And then how that is going to impact healthcare possibly in the future. We've got another team actually working with some architects. As I also do work on indoor air quality, I do building-based learning, high-performance buildings. One of my other books is on the power of existing buildings. Because right now I'm in a place where I can actually use indoor air quality monitors in my home to see how we're doing at home. I can control my home when I'm away and actually flush the air in the home and make sure it's better quality. When I walk outside of my home or our business school in downtown Pittsburgh, the air quality is 4 times or 3 times worse than it is inside our buildings. We're in one of the 8th worst polluted some cities in North America. So this is pretty tragic if we think about it that way. But instead, I set up people to learn about this in terms of the homes that we live in, the buildings we spend 93% of our time in pre-COVID, right? But yet they tend to be very inefficient, very unhealthy. So we take what would be an equivalent of 150,000 square foot building over 50 years old. It represents about 4.5 million buildings in the United States that are shared use and office space. It's our business school, and use that as a design competition, because I want students and others to see things when they drive by them or when they are in a car or in their own home and see a design opportunity for it to be more sustainable, with goals then for teams to get the building to carbon neutral or carbon neutrality. So we measure indoor air quality within the building. We have monitors set up with it. I work with different clients and different projects year round. We do almost 200 of them to date, and no 2 projects have been the same. So when we look at the UN SDGs, we see these, or sometimes people in the business world might see them as big problems. I want to say that they're going to be big problems if it's business as usual. Instead, if we turn this around and ask the question, well, what's the opportunity that comes out of this? Each of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is an opportunity for businesses, for universities to do something different. it should be looked at not as a problem, but an opportunity. And I was assuming we go in alphabetical order, so going last, I didn't want to put up too much about the systems that we all engage with, but have problems with. Our energy systems, 67% of all the energy created in the United States goes away in heat and friction. We waste that much. If you started a company and hired 100 people in January and you came back at the end of the year, 67 of them produced nothing but hot air, what would you do? Would those people still be there? Yeah, we do this every day when we switch on our lights, right? So instead, I live in a home that's a net positive home. So I create more energy than I consume in the home. I offload some of that for a car. I can drive that car on average $175 for 10,000 miles a year for any vehicle. Where in combustion vehicles and transportation, it wastes 81% of every gallon of gas that goes into it. Our food travels, 1,500 miles before we throw away 40% of it. In clothing, we're doing one of these projects with those RFID tags, that company we presented to you today with one of our teams. 25% of materials in the clothing industry actually is thrown away at the end of a year. We're looking at $25 billion of value. And as was brought up by Tim earlier, some of them are synthetic, right? They're not going to be recycled or upcycled or even downcycled. They're going to become hazardous materials sitting in landfills. There are 6 landfills within 25 miles of me right now, and I want them to go out of business. I want them not to be the place where we go to because they have the lowest tipping fees, but instead where we set up new businesses, create new industry in those shared spaces, so we can actually look at upcycling everything and having closed loop systems for this. These are the types of things I see as our opportunities. And I just came across something this week in a book I'm reading on CO2 that actually mentioned, on average in the United States, we have 300,000 things in our homes. And it's just as mind-boggling, again, but it's right after Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and heck, we had to go out and buy some more of this stuff, right? And the Story of Stuff video that many of you have probably seen says that we'll throw away 99% of all that within 9 months. It'll go to those landfills right now. And that's not where I want it to go. I want to see and look at these things and work with other people that see them as the places where we find value. We turn them into raw material inputs. So when students look at those 4 companies that are co-located next to each other downtown, they can look at creating shared steam systems for it, generating their own electricity, having transportation that's mass transportation, moves people between spaces, and shares other things that would have been waste in some form that they had to pay for, but instead becomes a raw material input, something they get paid to have or to move over to somebody else. And that was one of our other projects that we just presented on today with the mayor's office, who was one of the first 2 cities to sign up for the UN SDGs and be in compliance with them. And also we were the first ones to come out after Trump said that we didn't vote for him. Actually, we we voted for the other candidate, and we were wanting to stay in the Paris Accord, and we did. And we have goals actually at the city level of carbon neutrality within the next 20 years. So these are the types of things that we're doing in terms of what's going on around us. And we even value this in terms of putting a price on carbon dioxide. So we use the social cost of carbon. And we use this throughout our design planning. When we look at financial analysis, I want to look at not an ROI, IRR, or NPV, but I want to look at a return on integration, an integrated rate of return. And instead of a net present value that discounts the future, we want to start thinking about how we include environmental, social, and governance performance data within our financial capital expenditures. So that way we actually see a return on this that then becomes an integrated rate of return or integrated future value. And these are the ways in which we try to do things differently and how I try to fold in my research into what we are doing, not only in the classroom, but within my consulting and other things that I've been involved in. So I love sustainability as a sandbox because there's so much to do and so many opportunities for all of you to move this forward. We'll do that with the next slide. So with that next slide, why would I be optimistic about this when some people look at that picture in the lower left-hand column and think about, the first industrial revolution was such that we thought there were unlimited sinks for waste in nature, that people were expendable as part of our input processes, and that we could make and build whatever we wanted to without thinking about it and thinking about what comes out of this process either. Well, there's a new way to look at this. I'm optimistic because we understand our footprints. We measure that in terms of our impacts on the earth, but we also know that we have handprints and those things that can be regenerative. Net positive homes, circular economies, things that actually give back more to the earth than it takes to create them. Examples of these are living buildings or living products. So for a living building on an annual basis, it'll generate more electricity and water than it consumes. The same thing for people that have living products. So both of these are something that comes out of the International Living Futures Institute, and I'm involved with and part of their advisory board work with them. but they're examples of how we could actually have positive types of products. So this is part of my optimism. The other part of this is that we're all here talking about this, right? So there's people that are involved in design. We can do simulation. We can do scenario planning. We can look at building-based learning in those places where we spend all of our time. Instead, think about how this could be done differently. So as we bite and kick and scratch our way out of 2020 and go into 2021, let's see this as an opportunity for the pandemic to hit the reset button. And think about, we are all part of the largest social movement in our history. To have people from all different walks of life, all different industries, all different functions and perspectives, all want some of the same things: a better environment with less impact on it, better social governance, better social sustainability and performance metrics. We have these things actually tied into things where at the city level now we have, what, 26 different metrics of sustainability. If you want to look at and be a financial analyst of firms that are publicly traded in the United States, you can find almost 700 environmental, social, and governance performance metrics per publicly traded firm in the Russell 2000. If those publicly traded firms thought that no one was watching, they're wrong. We're all watching. We all have an impact with the dollars we spend and how we can actually move something forward and reward businesses that we see as more sustainable, like Evan mentioned also B Corps. We have 7 of them in Pittsburgh right now. We've had projects with them in the past out of Philadelphia to try to help move that model along. And we can reward companies that have integrated reporting where they actually integrate their financial report and their sustainability report on an annual basis. We know right now this is basically every company within the S&P 500. They're looking at sustainability. They have sustainability reports of some form. And we need people to be within those companies and move them forward and think about things in a different way when they're doing their decision analysis and capital expenditures. So these things make me optimistic. And we can go to the next slide. So some of the images that I had in the last slide were, the botanical gardens in Singapore, and having those things represent plants and what the built environment could look like. And as we move into what comes next, this is really based on your audience, right, Kelsey, your association, all of you, your networks, your friends, your social networks, and how all of us connect these ideas and think about them as opportunities. So with that call to action, we can go to our final slide. So this call to action is then to think about a different future. Part of the early part of our process in learning integrated management is also have a vision of something different for the future. And from that vision to backcast and into where we're today, to understand where we are with our current numbers, to then close the gap between where we want to be in the future with that vision. So what can we do? Well, there's a lot we can do in terms of UN SDG number 12. It's been mentioned by others before. So we have closed loop systems or circular economies. That's sort of the multicolored square next to the action learning diagram. That's on Kalundborg in Denmark. And think about industrial parks where they actually co-locate companies because they can take the waste from one to become a feedstock for another. So then we can also think about this in terms of we need change agents like you with big ideas. Incremental is nice. It's a good place to start, but a tragic place to stop if we're going to go for a 5% reduction in cost. Not going to get us there. But if we can turn your visions into value creation in terms of this is going to generate revenue, operating margins, asset efficiency, expectations. And with that one project we delivered earlier to a client today on RFID tags can reduce 25% overstocking and inventory issues within garments in the textiles industry or soft goods. There's a lot of ways in which they could use that, and they're trying to figure out in that industry how to make that a sustainability proposition. And using RFID technology is just one means of doing it. So the questions I had to the panel and to others are, so in this post-COVID world that's coming, someday we are going to get out of this, right? 19 will be behind us. Let's hope 20 is not right around the corner in terms of COVID-19 and COVID-20. But what would you want to build back better? It's not going to be business as usual. What do we want to have go away? What do we want to have as a new norm? And think about that vision being really big and really grand in terms of what this could look like. So anything is possible. And this can be done one decision at a time. We don't have to take on the whole globe. And within that context, I'm going to use something from Theodore Roosevelt to kind of close out on. And he wrote this in the context of it being only for men. So I'm going to try to make this a little bit more gender neutral as we go through it. But it's not the critic who counts. It's not the man or woman who points out how the strong person stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to those who are actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat, and blood, who strives valiantly, valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, which I think we all do around sustainability, the great devotions, and who spends himself or herself in a worthy cause, who at their best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at their worst, if he or she fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his or her place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who never knew victory nor defeat. So I guess my real message in the end is to dare greatly, and that we all should have a huge, big vision of what the future could be, and don't give up if we're only getting incremental progress along the way, because progress is progress. I think that took me a little bit over my time, maybe by a minute.
Thank you. And I don't know if you did this on purpose, but our school motto is Audamus, which is let us dare. So if you did, I'm going to give you the credit on that one, whether or not that was purposeful. But that was very clever if it was.
Idea, that is fantastic.
Always tends to work out that way. Thank you so much for giving us your presentations. We do have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to questions if students want to unmute themselves and ask questions, or pop them in the chat. If you wanted to go to the panel or just one individual, make sure you indicate that, and I'll open it up to let other people ask questions before I start on my little list here.
I'd love to start it off if I could. And hopefully my students will chime in and gain some confidence from my horrible question. You know, I think the thing that unified all of your narratives and Professor Goodstein's narrative as well was the idea of storytelling. It seems very apparent to me that 2017, 18, 19, 20 has been about storytelling. You know, either businesses telling us that they are becoming more sustainable, or telling us that we should be more sustainable, or us telling ourselves that we are sustainable, right? And I'm wondering how this kind of jives with something that was mentioned in everybody's presentation, but uniting the narratives of sustainability and profitability. So figuring out how to make the discourse of sustainability something that's not an obscure topic that we have in SDG conversations, but nowhere else, is actually front-loaded into the design of products, into the marketing of products, and then at last, probably reflecting Dr. Cooper's discourse, into the use and then discarding of products. So I wonder if you could all address that in your own ways.
No one wants to go first. All right. Thanks, Aziz, for the question. One of the ways in which we try to do this is through putting a value on carbon dioxide. One of my projects, even in this last January, was presented to Congress what would happen if we put a carbon tax on Pennsylvania, the impacts on all industries, and it would actually be a revenue neutral one where money is returned to people. You pay per household based on consumption and living and lifestyle. What we found is on average there'd be $156 to almost $500 payback to almost to homes in Pennsylvania. Corporations would pay more for it. It would increase jobs. It would drive industry. It would create real change in infrastructure investment. So one of the ways in which we try to do that is to put an actual price on things that haven't been priced, and CO2 is one of our favorite landing places for that.
I guess I'll profitability is not my strong suit. I leave that to the business people. But I do think the question of how to mainstream the sustainability, and that's also that's an important part of that question. And I guess one thing is the work that I do is largely about being able to bring into the conversation about sustainability and about the choices we're making as a society, being able to bring a bigger suite of what matters to us and what's important to us as human beings into that conversation, and finding ways to be able to talk about the values that we find important. And particularly what I study is the relational values. So the relationships between humans and nature in particular, that for many, many people on the earth, those are pretty important. And if you actually get to a point where you can talk about what's important and also make clear what our impact is. So I think, I ended on a very negative note, so I really appreciate the positive note that you brought into the picture, but I think that the flip side of the point that I said, that it's very hard to be sustainable in a global system, is that it's really hard to see what's going on. It's really hard to see the impact of your choices. And so I think for me, it's that, ideally we could bring more into our conversations this idea of what's really important, that we end up talking about economic value because that's what we have a language to talk about, and that's what we have a way to measure really easily. But there are lots of things that are really important to people. And so I think combining that economic profitability with a sense of what we want the world to look like and what the way we want things to be. That's the way I would go.
Yeah, I'm going to maybe build back on that too, to say that all the things that we do, even with our home or the buildings and carbon neutrality, is at a price point that's cheaper than doing business as usual. So let people know it's actually more expensive to continue with bad decision making. I generate my own electricity 40% cheaper than my utility company does. And it's a coal-based utility system, that I'm in terms of my eGrid location. I can drive that car, like I said, $175 for 10,000 miles. If people drive for 50 years out of their lives, they're going to spend about $100,000 on gasoline and mobility. And then they're going to waste 81% of it in heat and friction. Those types of things get people's attention, that it's cheaper and much more valuable or much more effective to do these things.
Yeah, and the efficiency thing. And then I think, as you mentioned, the certification. So that's definitely one thing I was going to say, that a certification is a way to make evident what the chain of impacts of something are. So I think that's definitely a way of getting away where people can make better choices because there's a system that tells them what's going on in the normally invisible part.
Tim, it looked like you were leaning in there for a second.
I guess for me, I need to go back to a debate that's been with us for 50 years, which is exactly what are our goals as society, and the whole challenge of how we build back better without going back to old economic models. So, I mean, I was impressed by the confidence of the last presentation. I think now is a time when people are really thinking about new opportunities and the new normal. Someone mentioned, I think, in the chat about what we actually mean by affluence. I just looked it up, actually, and affluence is to flow abundantly, a flood of riches. And I thought to myself, that seems to me to be the wrong word. It is actually flowing abundantly is the problem. We have so much stuff in society flowing through our houses, and the 300,000 that someone mentioned earlier. What also gives me a bit of confidence about the prospect of change is the way in which we have seen a number of things happening in recent years. First of all, there seems to be a bit of a change in people's engagement with stuff. I mentioned the repair cafes, but we have seen in the pandemic signs of a growth of interest in crafts, in making things yourselves. It's going back to the home and recognizing the mass produced isn't always the thing that gives you the most happiness. But to go back to what I started with, it's both a combination of addressing the throughput of stuff in society, but also getting that, and it does go back to this narrative that was mentioned. What language do we use to achieve progress? There's a guy called Tim Jackson who talks about prosperity without growth. And Tim's one of the best communicators in this area. Very, very skilled guy, not an economist by background, but writes very well about the economy. And I just think we have amongst our politicians, they seem locked in to the narrative of growth. And for years, when I was an environmentalist in the 70s and 80s, we had all the cliches. Environmentalists want to take us back to caves or whatever. I think we've got beyond that with the SDG debate. We haven't found a narrative to replace growth as GDP, as progress. That's I think is the next step.
Yeah, I wanted to articulate something I put in the chat, that in when you talk about values, frugality is actually pretty common. We might not think that in our society, but people don't like useless things. I think that relates to the point. If you tell someone what you're doing, your coal-based, carbon, whatever way you're powering your car is very inefficient, they're like, well, that's dumb. People don't like waste. And so I think that relates to what you said too, is that I think if you can tap into that and make clear how inefficient things are, then you can tap into a core value, and people will act based on that value. It's just not clear right now that that's happening.
I think that goes rather well with Eliza Olson's question in the chat about living sustainability becoming being a trend that fades. And as we've seen it over, since the 1970s and continuing. And while I don't think it's necessarily something that will fade, it's something that we need to put work into and consider as, your field, Dr. Gould, and considering people's behaviors. People are frugal. I myself go to thrift stores and secondhand stores to not only not buy something new because you don't want to waste products, but also because you don't want to waste money. You want to get something that is of good quality, that is cheaper. So there's definitely a important relationship between the two.
Yeah, but so what happens if you become where money doesn't matter as much? I think but I mean, I would be really interested to hear from you all. I think that's a really important question. I've thought about it with respect to veganism and vegetarianism, that it seems like that's trendy, right? It's cool. I don't know, maybe I'm biased, but I think there is an element of there's like a hipster line of veganism. And I'm so curious what's going to happen with that. Is that an enduring cultural change, or is that something that will change it with change in the life cycle as you get older? I don't know. So, I mean, I am very curious. I think it's an excellent question. And I would love to hear from people in your generation. Like, what do you think? do you think it seems, I don't know how to answer that question, but I think it's a great one. I don't know if others have thoughts.
I think we definitely have. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Sroufe.
I'm pretty biased, but I can't see it being a trend when there's so many people working on this in so many different places and for such a long period of time. It's just getting better, and we need to get it to a point where it's so easy that it's just part of what we do. And until people stop looking at it as a trade-off, which it does not have to be, it's something that it's got to be like the Staples easy button, right? You hit the button, and it's already part of it. When we buy a vehicle, it's baked into it. When we build a home, it's baked into it. Years ago, it was going to cost 3 to 8% more to build a building that was LEED Gold, LEED Silver probably. And now it's price parity, and we can get to LEED Platinum practically with the stuff. We can do living buildings. We can do passive house buildings. We can heat 1,000 square foot home with a hairdryer nowadays. And it's just better insulation. It's pretty simple stuff that all these other countries have been doing for so long that we just haven't let transition into our country yet as we consume more and more. And it's taking us longer than most have wanted, and still isn't going to get up to speed as quick as a few are really needing it to be.
I think it is. I just thinking about, I do appreciate bringing up COVID and really thinking about this moment of how can I think with your comment too, Assis, in the chat, that we're in a period where we're going to be rebuilding soon. As you said, hopefully at some point, the UK just approved the vaccine, right? Like it's going to happen. And so what does that look like? And how can we take advantage to make it, to take some of these elements? And I feel like we're all trying, everyone who works in this space is trying to think about how to take advantage of that. But it's very hard. I think especially when people want to go back to normal, there's this question of how can we take nuggets of what's happened right now and allow it to not be, there's the trend beyond COVID, and then there's what's happening in COVID, and trying to expand and maintain, I guess.
Pedro, it looks like you had your hand raised to ask a question. I think you're still muted there.
Okay. We can type in the chat.
Okay.
There you go.
There we go.
At the risk of sounding a little bit crude, I was wondering, we keep talking about we and sort of melding all of ourselves together in one unit as people. But do we ever think about groups, that some groups that may be more at fault when it comes to waste than others. Are Republicans more at fault than Democrats? Are Vermont people more at fault than Texans? And is it worthwhile to concentrate, or even a nation, is it worthwhile to think about where we need to focus our attention as far as sort of teaching people how to behave? Thank you.
I guess absolutely. I think it's a good point to dig into that language that we're using, and I think it's been mentioned a couple times. I didn't talk about it, but the other panelists all did. I think that different actors who are in the system at different places also. So I think it's also helpful from what I said to think about the individual actors and then aggregate societal actors at the different levels. And I think there are different leverage points. There are different interventions that apply to different points of the system. But I do think thinking about, so corporations and governments at different scales and individuals and educational systems. And I think there are lots of places and I don't know if it's helpful. I mean, I think if you're going to say who has more impact, then you have to have a metric for how. And I guess I don't know. I guess that could be helpful, but it could also be divisive. And so I think that being careful about if you're identifying that, then sort of taking the magnanimous approach and trying to understand why that is, why that difference is present, and not just finger pointing.
Yeah, I think industry for too long has been set up as the scapegoat, but for all the right reasons. But at the same time, that makes them want to turn their back on these conversations and think that there's only a target on their back and that they're not part of an opportunity to be in the solution set. So something that was even just presented today by one of my teams, I pulled up something from Ray Anderson, says, business and industry is one of the major culprits in causing the decline of the biosphere. And the really important part of this is they're also the only institutions that might be large enough and pervasive enough and powerful enough to really lead humankind out of this mess. So while they can be culprits and we can understand that, they can also be the opportunities to do this as Paul Pullman, Unilever, and others try to create change and move that small rudder on a really large ship. They also get to influence our consumption, right, and the ways in which we perceive products. And they can be the ones that are captains of industry, but also captains of opportunity in creating those opportunities in those spaces and those places with their products and then or their services that create groups, right, like Pedro was talking about. Different groups will be reacting to this message differently, and they are pretty good at targeting them already in terms of marketing. So our political factions, as we know, in terms of their ability to actually pull apart ourselves and put us into all these different groups. So I think we've got the technology and ability to do it. We just need the right leadership across the board in different locations, in different industries, to all be moving in the same direction and not fighting with each other over this.
I think that Pedro raises an interesting question about not generalizing people, and certainly any attempt to leverage change in society on the consumer side does demand that one does have a sophisticated understanding of consumers, because we are very complex as individuals. For me, actually, it's both and. Trying to change business is hugely complicated as well. Business has been relatively slow to act in terms of getting onto the environmental agenda, recognizing the importance of climate change. But there are a lot of people that I come across in industry, and I have quite a lot of contact in both the fashion industry and the electronics sector, who do want to do the right thing, but are having real problems identifying ways of making money doing the right thing. There's a psychological problem, I think, for many of them, that they've done the same thing for so many years. They're so rooted into maximizing sales, profit maximization, fast turnover, and stuff like that. That's which is problematic. But it isn't just about the psychology of the business people. It's actually also about the underlying systems. And that's where there's a need for collective response. And I think Rachel's comments about practice theory does raise interesting questions about structure, how you do change structure, because what industry needs is structural change to give them some kind of guarantees that if they do invest in very radical change in how they do business, that they will still be able to make money. If you look at the literature, there's a heck of a lot more articles, academic articles on behavior change than there is about business change. Genuine academic work on how you transform a business from being locked into a fast throughput business to one that is genuinely sustainable. There are very few examples found out. Companies like Patagonia, who have been doing the right thing for years and have proved you can survive. But they are precious few in number.
Yeah, Patagonia is another B Corp too, right? So a good example too of a company that's trying to change and also signal that change and that others can follow their lead. Some of this, I think, goes back to the earlier question too about storytelling, in that there has been a 100-year-long meme out there that says the fiduciary responsibilities of a company is to create only profit. And if we go back to the actual laws that created that in the early 1900s and what this corporate law kind of looks like, it actually says the fiduciary responsibility of a company is to create value for community. But yet that's been hijacked and taken over for the last 100 years. And we need that to come back to say that profit isn't the only thing. It's the creation of value, community, and then community can connect those groups. They can create better services and products that actually meet this value proposition and this license to operate for companies that has only been focused supposedly or myopically only on profits, and say, no, there's a whole bunch more that we can be doing. And then companies might want to get on the bandwagon then just tell their story about how they're better than their competitors because they're more dynamic. They have better ESG performance metrics, better products that last longer in the marketplace, better services that they provide as ancillary, things to their products, and how we can create a more, and I'm never going to use the word, we're not going to be the sustainable company, but we can be a more sustainable company and look at that as incremental improvement.
Dr. Gould, did you have something to say? Go ahead.
I'll say it very quickly. I really appreciate that. That's related to values, right? Is that we have this assumption right now that the purpose of businesses is profit. And I was just thinking there's a really great book called Grain by Grain by Bob Quinn and Liz Carlisle that really it's an example in the farming realm of what you just said of like the point of a company is to bring value in many different ways. And it talks about that in really interesting ways. So I appreciate that as a sort of reframing, and that's a structural change. And so I also think that the structures, like creating a way where the individual is interacting with the structure. And so I think that point of motivation that you ended with, Dr. I don't know how to pronounce your name, Sroufe.
Yep.
That's Sroufe. What is it?
Sroufe, you got it. You're good.
Okay. That interacts with, I think if you think like that interacts with the structural change, it's a system. And so individuals, I think, taking action to influence those structures, and then those structures expand and influence others. So I think that's a good place to end.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if you know this, but your professors, the semester's coming to an end no matter what school you're at, but we only have a couple weeks left in our semester. So this is our last SDG panel of the semester, and this was our first semester of doing it. So thank you so much for making it a really positive end to the semester. We really appreciate you guys coming and taking the time to speak with us. And I definitely am taking credit for making responsible consumption and production right after Black Friday and Cyber Monday. I don't participate in those things, so I'm going to pretend I didn't forget that's a thing that people do with regularity. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to speak with us, and we have people from all over the country to come and talk with us, which is one of the very few positives of COVID, that if anyone will email me back, I can talk to whoever I want, and I can bring them to our school, which was a big accomplishment that we wanted to gain for Champlain UNA and Champlain College as a whole. So I thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for putting it together.
Thank you. Really need to hear about all your work and your questions. Thank you.
Go out and change the world. Make it better than we ever imagined it could be.
Do it. Agree. Or imagine new things. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you so much. And I will hit stop on the recording.